Hey everybody, Dr. Patel here. Hope you all are doing well. Today we are going to kind of piggyback off of what we've discussed previously on ligament injuries and ligament laxity and talk about this condition called text neck. So I know this is something you may or may not have heard about before, but I think it's actually a really important conversation for us to have. Is it something that we need to be worried about? Is this something that could be causing pain conditions? Is this actually something that's new and scary since we're all using our cell phones now? Or is it actually something that isn't as scary as it sounds? So we're going to go over what exactly is text neck, what is the anatomy of text neck, and what are the options that we have for treatment. Before I go on, if you have any questions or concerns or comments, then please feel free to comment. If you have something to talk about your specific situation, or if you have any topics that you want me to discuss in the future, you could feel free to email us at info@fxregencenter.com or call us at 310-929-9790, or you can also DM us here at Facebook or on Instagram or Twitter or whatever. If you like these videos, please like, subscribe, share, and so without further ado, I'm going to get started and talk about text neck. So text neck. So first of all, I thought this picture was hilarious. I just was Googling text neck and this came up, and I thought that this was very appropriate for today's conversation. You may have or you may not have heard about the concept of text neck, and the theory goes as such. Because of the amount that we're using our cell phones and digesting information on our cell phones these days, right? How many of us never leave our cell phones behind when we're living our lives, right? But the concept came out that if you're looking down your cell phone repetitively over time, then that can develop neck problems, including neck pain or damage and things along those lines. And then, along the recognition that we can develop neck pains from various things, including cell phone usage, we started using this word text neck. And anytime somebody labels something, then all of a sudden it becomes this big hoopla that we need to be concerned about, because text neck is going to ruin your life. So the question really is that actually true? What is text neck? What can happen? And why is it sometimes perhaps not that big of an issue? And what does the data show, and what are the options that we have for treating these type of neck conditions? So first and foremost, what is text neck? The concept really is that, and there's various iterations of this graphic that are found online. Again, if you Google text neck, that this will undoubtedly show up. Is the concept that if we're looking down at different angles, that we're putting more pressure into the neck. So as this graphic demonstrates, and this is based off of a little bit of research, that basically at 0 degrees, the weight of your head on your neck is 10 to 12 pounds. And as we start to flex our head downwards, or flex our neck so our head is looking downwards, as the degrees of flexion increases, well, then the pounds of pressure that we're placing on our neck increases as well. And while this is legitimately true in regards particularly about the amount of pressure that we're putting on structures such as the discs, and amount of stretch we're putting on certain things like ligaments, the reality is that we have dynamic things, all right? And even if we're looking down at a certain angle for an extended period of time, our structures throughout our spine are very resilient and very strong, and can take a lot of beating. So even though this is true, the question comes down to is what is the context? Reality is, should we be fear mongering the idea of looking down at our text? And the answer isn't as simple as yes or no. The answer is kind of a little bit of shades of gray in between. But this concept of looking down constantly and causing pain, number one, there is some validity of this text neck concept and the possibility of that contributing to a pain condition. However, this is not something new, and this is not something that is this new kind of, pandemic, for lack of better words, that's going through the world because we now have cell phones. In fact, this is actually something that's been going on for a long time. So when we think about that head position of looking down, pre-cell phones, we had these things called newspapers and magazines and, foreign concept, I know, but books. So there are these things that we've always looked down on and read and engrossed ourselves in many, many ways, shapes, and forms in the past. Interestingly, there was not, to my knowledge, anything called newspaper neck in the past. But this is something that could contribute to symptoms in one way, shape, or form. And on the other hand, though, is not necessarily something that's the end of the world. So kind of going around and around here saying the same thing over and over again, but the reality is that just because we're using our cell phones more, just because posture is not something that's the best, does not necessarily equal pain. Now, that posture can contribute to symptoms, and I'm going to go through the anatomy of that in a second. But before I do that, I just one last driving point about words and how we got to be careful about fear-mongering and the idea of something like text neck being an issue. We think about things like back pain or low back pain. And I've said this before in previous talks. Back when railroads were first made, somebody started complaining about low back pain, and they happened to be riding on a railroad. So then they got diagnosed with railroad spine, and all of a sudden there was a huge increase in people complaining about railroad spine across the nation. And the same thing is happening now with text neck and this kind of uber focus on our posture. Again, the point of me saying this is that people can actually have bad posture and have no pain. But when we have an issue, when we have a pain condition occur, then things like texting, looking down at our cell phones, looking down at computers, looking down at books, our posture can then add fuel to the fire. So I'm going to go through some anatomy, and we'll be able to kind of talk about what actually happens when we let our posture affect our neck. What happens with text neck? So I'm going to draw a couple things here. So bear with me. We're going to draw like a little head here, and we're going to draw kind of a neck here. That doesn't look like anything, does it? Well, let's see how that goes. So the neck and the spine in general is like a stack of coffee mugs on top of each other. You may have heard me say this before, right? And if we think about what that looks like, these are kind of the coffee mugs here. These are the facet joints on either side. And over here we have the discs in between the coffee mugs. Okay. And then finally we have ligament structures that are connecting the spine together, connecting all the bones together. And as we discussed in our recent talks about ligaments being like those thick rubber bands that surround broccoli in the grocery store, those ligaments are ultimately providing support for someone in their neck and in their whole body. Right? Now, when we have this scenario, but we are looking down at our cell phones for long periods of time, then a couple things occur. So when we're looking down in this direction here, let's see if I can do this in a fancy way. If we're looking down, hey, how about that? If we're looking down like so, then ultimately what we're doing is we're putting more pressure onto the front part of the spine while stretching the back part of the spine. So if you could picture that, we're going from here and going downwards like so, right? I don't know if that really makes sense, but I hope that does. As we're doing that, we're putting pressure onto things like the discs, right? And we're stretching things like the ligaments. So over time, as we're doing this, that increased pressure onto the discs can, in theory, contribute to some increased disc degeneration or disc bulges, things along those lines. And the increased stretch to the ligament structures can, in theory, cause some stretching of those rubber bands over time. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily mean the end of the world. But if we have that scenario and then we do something funky that causes an aggravation or injury, well, then that's a situation where we end up starting developing pain. So what happens in those circumstances? Well, if we have stretched out these ligaments in the back here, then our muscle structures end up wanting to tighten up in order to protect the spine. So in the back here, we have muscles that are connecting these areas together on either side of the spine. We have these bigger muscles that go from here and all the way down to our shoulders and all the way down to our upper backs. These are called the traps on either side. And we have these deeper muscles in the front of the neck on either side, the back of our head over here. And all of these muscles end up tightening up in order to strengthen and make up for the ligaments that are getting looser. So if we are doing, these poor postures, so to speak, over time, then it ends up being kind of priming the pump for an injury. And it ends up being a situation where it in a sense can be a repetitive injury that's taking place over time. When we have a repetitive injury, things are gradually getting irritated over time, and then it's just a matter of the straw that breaks the camel's back, something small, something minute that can then cause a significant pain issue to occur. Now, if you have this type of text neck phenomenon going on, and if you then get into a bigger injury, such as a motor vehicle accident, that's the type of situation where more trauma can occur, like something like a tear to the disc bulge, or irritation to the nerves, or things along those lines. Now, I had a patient last week that told me, she was a young patient in her mid-20s, that started developing neck and upper back symptoms. And she had no specific injury that was associated with it, but she had just graduated from college and started a job in which she was working long hours at a desk. So while she was doing that, she admits to having poor ergonomics at her new desk, and doing a lot of hours on laptop, and looking down at her laptop, looking down at her cell phone for long hours over the course of the day. So it wasn't actually the act of looking down that was the end of the world, but it was this rapid change in her level of activity and then repetitively doing something in a poor ergonomics over time. And this is something that over time had aggravated or stretched out her ligament structures, and her muscles were then reacting to that. And this is really what it comes down to. text neck is not necessarily, like the worst thing in the world, but certainly something that could contribute to your picture overall. So what do we do about it, right? What do we do about this text neck phenomenon, and how do we prevent it from occurring? Well, really, first recognizing certain signs. So, for example, if you are looking down at your cell phone for a long time, and if you then straighten out and start feeling a little bit of stiffness, or if you're feeling some muscle tightness, recognizing that before things get worse can be a great way for us to realize that, all right, maybe we're putting ourselves into a position that's inappropriate. If you do recognize that, then adding on some specific exercises could be really, really beneficial in order to try to offset the excess stretch that you're putting into the neck. So strengthening the muscles of the neck, of the upper back, and even the trunk and the core can actually be very, very beneficial at improving the posture and the ergonomics of what we're doing. Paying attention to ergonomics itself ends up being an important thing, because if you're recognizing that you're getting little stiffness and little things here and there, then perhaps setting up the appropriate rig as far as your computer is concerned, your cell phone, all of that kind of stuff ends up being crucial as well. For example, the setup that I have in my office, I actually have a standing desk with a tall seat. So I can alternate between sitting and standing. I actually have multiple screens, and with the font relatively large, so I'm not leaning into the screen at all times. And I actually have one of those, arms that clamp onto the table that I put my cell phone on. So my cell phone is actually staying at a high level here, and I can look at my cell phone and answer that as needed without looking down for constant hours. Now, when you're out and about in public, unfortunately, you got to kind of look like a crazy person. But if you're feeling a little bit of discomfort in your neck, then looking at your cell phone in front of you rather than looking down could actually be a beneficial way of causing less aggravation. Of course, you got to be careful about that, because people might think you're taking pictures of them, and we got to be careful on that front, of course. But really, paying attention to ergonomics, doing some specific stretching and exercises can be fantastic for battling this text neck and any other kind of postural aggravations to neck pain. If neck pain is not improving with simple changes to ergonomics, then doing physical therapy might actually be really beneficial. When I say physical therapy, I don't mean massage, I don't mean electrical stimulation, I don't mean chiropractic treatments. I mean specifically learning exercises that are tailored for your condition to strengthen the muscles around the neck, upper back, etc. Again, in order to battle some of the things that are going on in terms of our posture. We do have to be careful about chiropractic treatments. You heard me say this in the previous talks talking about ligament injuries. Gentle manual therapy to relax the muscles, to keep you in a good position might be beneficial for pain relief. But ultimately, we have to be careful about things like those high velocity cracking adjustments, because if this is associated with ligament looseness, if we're doing these kind of high velocity maneuvers haphazardly or aggressively or too repetitively, that can cause the ligaments to get looser, which again adds fuel to the fire, as I discussed last week. An occasional chiropractic or osteopathic or other manual adjustment may not be the end of the world. But we do have to be careful about it, and quite frankly, this is what's called a passive treatment, and we really should be focusing on active treatments, namely strengthening the muscles around the neck. And if we're not getting where we need to go with that, there are other things that we can do. I don't typically recommend cortisone injections, But there are simple injections of just numbing solution that could be done into various muscles that are tight and angry, and these, what are called trigger point injections, can actually help relax those muscles. But we have to couple that with the appropriate strengthening exercises, because if we just relax those muscles and they're not firing properly, well, then we're going to end up putting abnormal pressure into the neck again. And again, the name of the game is to strengthen things in order to keep our head straight, to battle that excess flexion that may be occurring with text neck. And finally, there are injection treatments that could be done to strengthen the ligaments. Right? Because if this is a repetitive stretching of the ligaments that is occurring with text neck or with other postural issues, the ligaments themselves may be loosened over time. And if we're not able to provide enough stability with just strengthening the muscles correctly, then we can do targeted injections into the ligaments using things like sugar water or prolotherapy, or using things like a patient's own blood growth factors called PRP, to actually strengthen those ligaments and then allow those muscles to relax and get strengthened appropriately. So we have a lot of different treatment options for situations like this, but really the fundamentals come down to, number one, not getting fearful of movement, and not getting stuck on this, diagnosis of text neck being the end of your life. But instead focusing on returning back to appropriate motion, strengthening the muscles, working on ergonomics, fixing the way that you do things so that you're not continuously causing repetitive injury. And ultimately, by doing that, by getting back to moving correctly, we can battle the neck pain that may be associated with text neck. Hope that all made sense. I know I blabbed on a little bit there, so I apologize for that. But looking at the comments, Peter said hi. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for joining. I'm glad that you joined us, and I'm glad for anybody that joined us today and who joins us on a regular basis. If you have any questions about text neck, or if you have questions about other conditions, then please feel free to comment, email us at info@fxregencenter.com, or DM, or call us. There's a lot of ways to contact us. If you missed any of our previous talks, then you can always find them at our website, fxregencenter.com, or on our YouTube channel. Just look up Shaunak Patel or FX Regen Center, and you'll be able to find us. That's really all I got today. So I hope you all are doing well. Wishing you guys a happy, healthy weekend and a good week ahead. And I will see you next Friday.